Hello, this is Sol Luckman. It's my pleasure to welcome you to Conversations on Sol Luckman Uncensored, sponsored by snooze2awaken.com, resources for lucidity. For more information about my work, including a lot of cutting-edge free content, check out crowrising.com. I'm also on Telegram, where I'm sharing daily truth bombs at t.me/solluckman. And I'm absolutely crushing it on Substack at solluckman.substack.com. If you appreciate what I'm doing here and interviewing some of the greatest minds and hearts in the whole truth and nothing but community, please take a second to give this video and channel some love energy exchange. Comment, like, subscribe, and by all means, consider buying me a cup of coffee that I'll be sure to savor with a toast in your honor. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome Brad Marshall, creator of the Croissant Diet. Yes, you heard that correctly. Stay tuned because this new understanding of fats and accompanying approach to diet could literally transform your body and life. Brad's work radically recontextualizes current dietary fads, including keto, paleo, and carnivore diets, within a framework of established nutritional concepts inspired by French culinary traditions. Brad's groundbreaking ROS theory of obesity, elaborated on his blog at fireinabottle.net, posits that ROS, or reactive oxygen species generation in fat cell mitochondria, explains how a Chinese peasant diet, low in fat with most of its calories from starch, a French diet of butter, wine, and flour, and a contemporary keto regime all can lead to leanness, whereas mixing flour and polyunsaturated fats is literally a recipe for obesity. The inspiration behind this groundbreaking theory stems from the blog Hyperlipid, which I will link to. Brad puts this hypothesis to the test with the Croissant Diet, and the results are pretty mind-blowing. Brad is also founder of Firebrand Meats, dedicated to providing pork and poultry low in linoleic acid, the N6 polyunsaturated fat, or PUFA, that has contributed to the global obesity pandemic. Brad has a degree in genetics from Cornell, as well as a certificate from the French Culinary Institute. For the last 15 years, he has raised rotationally grazed pastured pork on his farm in upstate New York, while running a butcher shop, local food restaurant, and USDA inspected meat processing facility. Talk about a Renaissance man. Thanks so much for joining me today, Brad. How the low PUFA are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, it's great to have you here. You know, I've been following your work since sometime in the fall of last year, and I have to say, when I saw, the name Croissant Diet, I wasn't sure whether to take it seriously, and of course I started reading your material and I realized you were dead serious, and that was really cool, and I learned a lot doing that, and I started listening to some of your podcasts and whatnot, and I thought, if I could ever just get you on the show, I think a lot of people will be absolutely fascinated by this material. I do energy healing, and I've written a couple books, and I talk some about diet and cravings and that sort of thing, but your stuff really resonated with my experience in the world, because I lived in France for a long time, and
Right.
I had exactly the same question. How do these people who don't exercise for jack, who eat God knows what, anything really, and a lot of it, frankly, how in the world do they maintain these svelte physiques that you see walking around Paris?
Right. Exactly. Right. And that's the exact question that I started with. And the same thing is true historically in America, that the diet was very high in flour and sugar and butter and pork and beef. It was the traditional diet was a very rich diet, cream, whole milk, and yet if you look and according to data from the USDA, people ate a tremendous number of calories. It's not just that the diet was rich, but they were preventing. It's not like they were dieting, right? They just ate.
Skimping, right?
Right. They just ate and they were lean. And that changed, really only in the last probably 50 years or so. And so, right. And so the question is why? What happened, right? That's the great mystery.
What I would like to do is just briefly share my experience of doing a version of this diet for, well, since really the beginning of January, mostly on, very little off, but I've kind of eaten pizza here and there on that kind of thing,
Sure.
kind of, halfway measures. But what I've noticed in myself, and I was in pretty good shape to start with, like, I was pretty thin, but what I had noticed over time is that it took a little more exercise to keep myself at that weight, right?
Right.
And I was doing versions of just experimenting with things like paleo and keto and other things, just trying to kind of figure out, because I'm in my mid-50s now, and I'm like, okay, something's going on here. And my partner Lee and we started doing the diet, and I noticed that I pretty quickly that I could go longer without eating, without thinking about it. And I know you've talked about your experience with that, which was fascinating to me. And then I also noticed that I had more strength and energy. Just
Yeah.
overall, I just got actually a little bit physically stronger. I noticed that, like, I was
Right.
well fed for the first time in a very long time. And then over the course of the last 6 months, 8 months, I've actually noticed that the shape of my body has changed. And Lee has experienced exactly the same thing. Our legs changed. They got thinner and more muscular. I saw my sister after I'd been doing this a while, and she, it had been quite a while since we'd seen each other. She looked at me. I had shorts on, and she said, "Oh, you have your young person legs back." Have you heard of that kind of thing from people?
I mean, I've never heard that specific comment before, but I love it. That's great. Yeah, I mean, I also, noticed that was, that was the funny thing when I initially did the croissant diet. I kind of, I did lose weight on the scale, but it wasn't, it was like 15 pounds or something, but I had a lot of weight to lose, but more than that, it was like the shape of my body changed. Yeah, it was like less, it was less fat in the abdomen, and that was really the most dramatic thing for me, was getting rid of that kind of belly fat. But it is kind of amazing when it works like that. You make that change and you see the results, right? And you're like, wow, that's crazy. Now let me ask you
on other diets, right? Just kind of knowing the lay of the land, the current, I would say, dietary fads in some cases. I use that word in the introduction. So, anyway, you were going to ask me a question.
Well, I was going to ask, did you do any kind of supplementing with stearic acid, or did you just switch to butter and that kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, and I have some questions about, some aspects of that, but yeah, I've been getting the stearic acid from you for a while,
Right.
and I also found this amazing ghee from Dr. Tom Cowan. It's I forget the letters. It's like A2 something 2 or something like that. It's the, you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, A2 is the so in dairy, there's a with the Holstein cow, which is kind of the modern cow, one of the genes that it had, it's called A1, and the A1 is more more allergic, more allergenic. Like, people have a response to the A1, and a lot of people who can't tolerate the A1 milk proteins can tolerate the A2 version of the milk proteins, which is what was in the old, like, Jersey cows, which was where most American farmers, at least, were getting their milk up until at least until the 50s or 60s. And even farm families, even now, some of them keep Jersey cows, just for the family, even though the commercial herd are Holsteins. Holsteins are Holsteins are the black and white cows, for people who don't know, and Jerseys are the old brown cow, like in the saying, "How now, brown cow."
Oh, now brown cow. That's right. So, I happened on that, and I was assuming, because of the whole ruminant animal thing, that wouldn't be a problem doing a slightly different kind of milk. I haven't seen that made any negative difference in terms of how I was using the ghee. I would melt that, and then I would dump a lot of the stearic acid in that and use that,
Right.
you know, in either as a butter substitute or along with butter.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And then I also got your sterculia oil,
Oh, nice.
and I've used that. I wasn't sure if I was supposed to use that before meals, but that's typically how I've done it. Is that an okay way to do it?
Yeah, I'm sure that helps with digestion. I mean, I think it's pretty easily digested anyway, but I think that right before meals is probably the perfect time to use that just to maximize absorption.
And I've done a tiny bit too, Brad, of some of the wine fasting aspects, just because I thought it was hilarious. And then, I mean, I like wine, so that was
Sure.
really cool. But you know, I wanted to share just a little, the little thing that you wrote on your blog, and I'll put a link in our show notes. I just really want people to know kind of what we're talking about. It's like, what the heck are these people even going on about? And this is just this little section in one of your earlier articles, and it's called the ROS Theory of obesity. And I thought we could maybe break that down.
Right.
In terms of, if you don't mind, I'm just going to read a few paragraphs just to give people just a really quick overview.
Absolutely, do it.
You're a good writer, by the way. So
Thank you.
I know you're well educated and all that. So the ROS theory says that energy balance is largely controlled by the interplay between ROS, which is reactive oxygen species produced in the mitochondria and hypothalamus, and hormones like insulin and leptin. In this theory, saturated fat, both from the diet and produced in the body from carbohydrate, acts as a molecular switch that, by creating ROS in the mitochondria, toggles the metabolism between running on glucose and running on fat. Saturated fat provides metabolic flexibility, the ability to tap into fat stores when available. ROS, generated from saturated fat metabolism, oxidation, is the signal that prevents cells from switching from fat metabolism to glucose metabolism. They do this by creating a short-term condition of physiological insulin resistance, which prevents cells from responding to insulin, and therefore switching over to glucose burning as long as the cells are still burning saturated fat. You read that correctly. I'm arguing that everything we think we know about obesity is exactly backwards. And I would just add, that's the beautiful moment, the aha moment. Instead of choosing unsaturated fats to avoid free radical formation, which leads to insulin resistance, we should be seeking out long-chain saturated fats, which cause free radical formation, which leads to physiological insulin resistance. The ROS theory is the first theory of obesity I've seen that can explain the situation in China, France, and the US. In addition, it explains why ketogenic diets work and why low-fat diets, which seem to work well in China, often fail in America. So it's just fascinating when you start breaking this down and looking at, you know, you're almost doing a kind of sociological study here, where you're looking at all of these different cultures and trying to find the common denominators about having to do with obesity or its opposite.
Right. And just to add to that point, you know, I think the diet that doesn't work is combining starch and carbohydrates with vegetable oil, right? Which is exactly what we do in America. You know, everything is soybean oil. Everything is, you know, mayonnaise, salad dressings. They're all soybean oil. Everything in a restaurant is cooked in soybean oil. Everything that comes out of a fryer is cooked in soybean oil, right? And so America eats a tremendous amount of soybean oil, vegetable oils in general, but soybean oil specifically. And that's never really been tried anywhere in the world before. Well, now everyone's doing it, but we were the first country to ever eat that way. And the obesity epidemic started here. And so that's right. And so that's a lot of well, before we were eating, you know, flour and sugar and butter, and that was okay. But now we eat flour, sugar, and soybean oil, and it's not okay anymore. So that, yeah, right. So that's what happened.
Nuts and nut flours playing into that equation as well. Nuts.
Well, you know, if you're someone who struggles with your weight and with your waistline, which I think these days is probably most of us, I don't love, you know, eating nuts, full fat nuts or nut butters, those kinds of things. I think that fat is pretty unsaturated. And I think that, you know, and this is where kind of the torpor theory comes in, but you know, hibernating animals in the fall will eat acorns, and acorns are full of unsaturated fats, polyunsaturated fats, and a lot of monounsaturated fats as well. And they do that specifically to engage some physiological processes that allows them to store fat for winter and then lower their metabolic rate so they can hibernate. And in fact, if you take this experiment has been done many times. You can take a squirrel that is that it's a hibernating species of squirrel, which there are a bunch of in the US, and you put them in the lab and you feed one of them. Usually they feed them sunflower oil. And if you feed the other one, most of the experiments I've done, they use sheep suet. So this is from, suet is the most saturated fat from most ruminant animals. And so they took mutton suet or something from a sheep, and they fed them that fat. And the squirrels who got the mutton fat or the suet, they didn't gain as much weight going into winter, and they actually failed to hibernate. They failed to lower their metabolic rate all the way down to where they could hibernate, because those unsaturated fats are the trigger, the switch that get you into torpor and having a lower metabolic rate and a lower body temperature. And there is an epidemic today in America of low body temperature, right? There's a lot of people walking around with a body temperature of 96.5. And 100 years ago, when they did the research, they were like, oh yeah, human body temperature is 98.6, or 150 years ago, however long that was. But today it's not. Americans have a body temperature well below 98.6.
Fascinating. That is fascinating.
Yeah. And
You're
so
basically saying that people are walking around like animals preparing to hibernate, and they're going into a state called torpor.
Yeah, I am. And I'm arguing that. And so when we talk about torpor, there are 160 species of mammals who are known to go into torpor, and they're spread all across the mammalian family tree. So the oldest species that can go into torpor is the spiny anteater. They lay eggs like platypuses. Like, that is the oldest mammal in existence. And then even the gray lemur, the dwarf lemur that lives in Madagascar, is a primate that can go into torpor, that is known to hibernate. And then there's 160 species in between those two. So the only way that can happen biologically is if the original mammal that we all evolved from already had the ability to hibernate and to get into torpor, this lower metabolic state, which makes a lot of sense, because having a warm-blooded metabolism is very energetically costly. And if you have to survive winter, or some animals go into torpor in the dry season, like in California. And so anytime that you're facing kind of a food shortage, if you can go into this torpor state, it helps you conserve energy, right? And so it seems like this is something all mammals have the genes to, like, we have the sort of innate ability to turn on this torpor if we know how, right? And humans we're obviously, we're not a hibernating species, but we're really, really closely related to animals who are hibernating animals. And so we can still turn a lot of those switches, right? And I think that the vegetable oils do that. And I also would like to touch on the point about the ROS theory of obesity. I kind of glossed over that, but I want to explain a little bit about that. So due to the way that essentially we run our metabolism essentially in our mitochondria, they're like the powerhouse of the cell, as they say. And the mitochondria is set up in a way that saturated fat create more of these reactive oxygen species than polyunsaturated fats do, and in fact than all unsaturated fats do. And so that is those ROS. People were very scared about them for a long time, but in fact, if you look at the way the mitochondria is set up, our whole metabolism is really underpinning them. And even since I wrote that article, I found out that the enzymes involved in glucose metabolism also create reactive oxygen species. So pyruvate dehydrogenase is the main enzyme that allows us to burn glucose. Glucose is broken down into pyruvate, and then pyruvate goes through pyruvate dehydrogenase to enter the mitochondria and be part of what they call the Krebs cycle or the TCA cycle. And that's how we burn glucose for fuel. And that enzyme, while it's working, continually is cranking out reactive oxygen species. And
Are
so
you basically saying that oxidative stress is not the total boogeyman it's been made out to be?
no, in fact, I think that oxidative stress is actually a function of something called reductive stress, which in theory is supposed to be the opposite of oxidative stress, but it actually kind of drives oxidative stress when you look at how it all works. And that's that's complicated. And it's funny because a lot of the mainstream literature is coming around to realize, like, mainstream science is slowly coming around to realizing that reductive stress is the real problem. And reductive stress is, like I say, it's kind of the opposite of oxidative stress, but it also causes oxidative stress.
I was going to say, reading your material, it was pretty clear there's an interaction there.
Right, absolutely. And so because what it comes down to is it's just flow of electrons. So, when we talk about calories, right, what we're really talking about is in our food and carbohydrates and fats, we have these energetic electrons. And those electrons want to flow back down to oxygen. And that's why it's called oxidation. And when that happens, oxygen is called the terminal electron acceptor. And, our food is mostly made of carbon and hydrogen, and, carbon and hydrogen share bonds between them, and those are the electrons. They live between the carbon and the hydrogen, and that's what causes that bond. And basically so that's how we eat our food. It's hydrocarbon. And when we exhale our food, it's water vapor, H2O, and CO2, right? We breathe out CO2. And so what happens is the carbon, instead of being bound to hydrogen, winds up bound to oxygen, and the hydrogens, instead of being bound to carbon, end up being bound to oxygen. So oxygen, at the end of the day, when it replaces carbon and hydrogen bonds, gives off a ton of energy. We're actually doing the opposite thing that plants do in their chloroplast, right? Plants take energy from the sun, and they take CO2 and H2O, and they build it into carbohydrate and fat, and we in our mitochondria do the exact opposite thing. Anyway,
so cycling down into torpor, that we're decreasing our energy output.
Yes, exactly. And the right, to jump into all of those mechanisms about how exactly that happens, obviously is complicated.
Right. We don't have to go there, but I did want to touch on, we're talking about, all of this stuff. I wanted to make sure you touched on SCD-1.
Right. And so SCD-1 is an enzyme that we have, and what happens is when you eat, this can again be thought of through the lens of torpor. An animal that is getting ready for winter, right? You need to store fat. It's your biological imperative to store fat. And so what happens is when you eat a bunch of soybean oil, that's a trigger to your body. Winter's coming, right? The body thinks you're probably eating acorns or something that are produced in the fall that are producing these unsaturated fats. The body's thinking winter's coming, we've got to fatten up. And so in response to eating the vegetable oil, you start to produce more of this enzyme called SCD-1. And SCD-1 turns the saturated fats that you have stored in your body into unsaturated fats. And so it kind of compounds the problem, right? The problem started with our dietary fat was too unsaturated. Now you have these enzymes that are, turning your own stored body fats and making them also too unsaturated.
Don't the ruminant animals do something similar in the opposite direction?
Yeah. So ruminant animals are, they have, bugs that live in their rumens, right? So they're actually fermenting the food. And So if they eat, if they eat carbohydrates and fiber, they're fermenting it all, and they're taking in only the things that are released by the bugs that live in their rumen, the bacteria that live in their rumen. And so the bacteria tend to give off things like succinate, and they give off pyruvate, or not pyruvate, butyrate, these kind of short chain saturated fats and these other things. And so the cows take those and they rebuild them into their own kind of body fats. And so they're really not, so in a ruminant, you have this whole extra step that's kind of gating what you take in your diet, right? So if you give a cow vegetable oil, the bacteria break it down into something totally different, and then the cows reabsorb that and they can turn it back into saturated fat, because animals can make saturated fat and they can make monounsaturated fat, but they can't make the polyunsaturated fat like you find in soybean oil. And so so since the cows have this extra kind of processing step, they're like, I would say that a human, you kind of are what you eat. If you eat a lot of polyunsaturated fat, you'll store that polyunsaturated fat. That's not necessarily the case with ruminants, because they break everything down first.
This is why you could have beef from an animal that's been eating, let's say, I don't know, lots of soybeans. I don't know if they do that, but just for the sake of argument, and they would be actually producing low PUFA kind of Croissant Diet meat. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's right. And they're not 100% protected from it. It's like a cow, a cow that's fed a lot of soybean oil might have 3 to 5% polyunsaturated fat, as opposed to a cow that's never fed any polyunsaturated fat might only have 1 or 2% polyunsaturated fat. But if you were to feed that same polyunsaturated fat to a pig, it might end up with 30% polyunsaturated fat in its fat. And so a lot of the pork, and especially the chicken that we eat, is surprisingly high in polyunsaturated fat, because we're feeding the pigs and chickens, we're feeding them corn, and we're feeding them soybeans, and it accumulates, right? And so now you have this trigger to kind of get you into torpor and to put you into fat storing mode, and you're getting it not only from the obvious thing like soybean oil, but it's also coming in from chicken fat and pork fat. So
in addition to the nuts and seeds and their oils, you have to watch out for certain meats that you might be eating that would have taken that in.
Right, exactly. And it's right. And it's hard and it's frustrating, because obviously you're like, okay, well, what is there left to eat? But
actually, there's a lot to eat when you figure it out. I mean, I want people to know that Brad's on a bit of a condensed schedule, and so I'm peppering in with questions and kind of directing the conversation a little bit, because I want to get to some things, and I'm being selfish because I have some questions. But I really want to encourage everybody to go to fireinabottle.net and just read the website, read the blog. I also want you to know that we've gotten some of Brad's products, and you're still doing the farming at this point in time, right? With the low PUFA meats.
Yes. Yep. I'm raising low PUFA pork over at firebrandmeats.com. And that stuff ships everywhere in the US. So it's really good. It's the only true, I think, low PUFA source of pork that we are actually, testing each batch, and we know exactly our pigs. The last test had about 6% polyunsaturated fat in them.
Wow.
And the commercial stuff that I sent as a comparison had about 17% polyunsaturated fat. So that's, it's a pretty big difference between what we're doing.
Be like kryptonite for the Croissant Diet. So while we're talking about PUFAs a little bit, say more about PUFAs in general. I know we've kind of been dancing around that term, but what is what does it stand for? What are we actually talking about?
Right. So PUFA is just PUFA, and it stands for polyunsaturated fatty acid. And so these are the fats that, like I say, they're in most vegetable oils: soybean oil, sunflower oil, safflower oil, canola oil to a great extent, and also, like I say, unfortunately, in chicken and even in pork. And these are fats that they're very liquid liquid fats. You know, if you put soybean oil in the refrigerator, it never becomes hard. It always stays a liquid, right? And that's why northern plants have them. Plants from northern climates are full of polyunsaturated fat because they don't get solid in the winter, and those plants have to grow in the cold, and so they don't want solid fats. The same thing with salmon. Salmon grow in really cold water, and so they have a lot of polyunsaturated fats. And so those fats have multiple double bonds. Saturated fats are like long, straight strands, and they pack together really tightly, and that's why they become solid. The polyunsaturated fats are this very kind of kinky shape. They're like C-shaped or Z-shaped, and so they don't pack together as tightly, and that's why they stay liquid. And that's okay, except that you know, it does become this kind of signaling molecule to tell the animal, to tell the human, okay, well, you're in the north, winter's coming, you know, you should be storing fat for winter, right? And that is that's kind of the problem with them. They also have a tendency to oxidize, and when the bad kind of oxidation, where they're actually, the molecules are becoming damaged, and they have a lot of there's a lot of what they call oxidized oxalams, oxidized linoleic acid metabolites. Linoleic acid is the most common polyunsaturated fat in our diet. That's what's in soybean oil. And they can get oxidized and make these byproducts that participate in inflammation and participate in a lot of other kind of problematic areas of biology. And so that's another
reductive stress.
Yes, I absolutely believe that they lead to reductive stress. And I just want to say reductive stress is a complicated sounding term. It really just means that you have too much energy in your mitochondria. And that's typically in the form of NADH and something called acetyl-CoA. Those two things build up in the mitochondria as a result of eating too much vegetable oil. And to the mitochondria, when the mitochondria thinks, there's too much energy in here, that's a trigger for the mitochondria to turn on de novo lipogenesis, which means fat making. Mm-hmm. And so the mitochondria, when it's overloaded with NADH and acetyl-CoA, it will actually slow down your metabolic rate, and you'll start making fat. Whereas if you can keep the mitochondria on the lean side without so much NADH and acetyl-CoA, it'll just keep happily running metabolism, and you'll have a higher metabolic rate, and you'll kind of have a clean burning mitochondria. And that's really what you want.
Nice. Now, it is what can you say about palm oil and coconut oil in relation to this discussion?
I'm not a fan of palm oil. Palm oil is relative. Palm oil is a weird thing. I think a lot about palm oil, and I don't have a concise answer other than to say that the composition of palm oil is very much matches what a human's body fat would look like if they were doing a lot of de novo lipogenesis. Palm oil has quite a bit of monounsaturated fat. It has a fair amount of polyunsaturated fat as well. Even though it is high in one particular saturated fat, which is palmitic acid, but it's very low in stearic acid, and it's relatively high in linoleic acid. And so palm oil really matches what it would look like, what your body fat would look like if you were doing a lot of this de novo lipogenesis. And so I think the body sees it incoming as like, okay, cool, we're doing de novo lipogenesis. I guess we're storing fat for winter, even though it is more saturated than some of those other fats. So palm oil is kind of a weird one. Coconut oil, I like significantly better. Coconut oil is mostly saturated. It doesn't have much stearic acid. And so that's, I would like it more if it had more stearic acid content, but there's a lot of good things about coconut oil. And the truth is I haven't experimented with it enough to have a good idea. And some of the trials I see with it, I really like, and other ones I'm less excited about it. So jury's still out on coconut oil, but
Fair.
it's not a bad thing. You know, especially if it's not like in small quantities. I'm sure coconut oil is fine. It's absolutely fine.
Now, conversely, and I'm sure a lot of people would be interested in this question, what about cacao and chocolate?
Cacao is great. Cacao is one of the highest, most natural sources of stearic acid, and the reason that I talk about stearic acid, I should tell people. So stearic acid is kind of a unique fat. It's the longest saturated fat chain that we normally get in our diet. It has 18 carbons, and it's a saturated fat, and it seems to act like almost like a fiber. It's very slowly absorbed in the intestine. It travels into the mitochondria very slowly, and so it's burned very slowly. And so
I want to give the listeners a Brad Marshall quote that I love. Stearic acid is the fiber of fats.
Yes, that's right. And so because it's really slowing fat absorption down, and it's slowing fat, transfer into the mitochondria. And like I was saying, when I said that the issue is when the mitochondria gets overloaded with energy, then it goes into that, it starts doing de novo lipogenesis, and polyunsaturated fats are the opposite of stearic acid. They are very preferentially transferred to the mitochondria to be oxidized. They move very quickly. They get in there and they overload things. And stearic acid kind of pulls the reins back on that. And it's a way of really slowing down that flow. And I think it allows, it just kind of paces things and allows the mitochondria to stay ahead and burn cleanly. And so even though, sure, you can show in a short-term feeding trial that if you sit someone down and give, one person, cocoa butter, which is very high in stearic acid, and another person sunflower seed oil, and the next, 4 hours, they'll have a higher metabolic rate with the sunflower oil, because the sunflower oil is shooting into the mitochondria and wanting to be burned. So in the very short term, feeding trials, right, it looks pretty good. But I think in the long term, I think that's it's kind of like, well, if you eat super processed starch, you get this big blood sugar push, and in the short term, your metabolic rate probably will be higher. But in the long term, that's probably not what you want. You probably want starches that are absorbed more slowly, and stearic acid does that, for fat, right?
Yes. So on the subject of stearic acid, Brad, one of the things that I've studied for a long time is detoxification, how to detoxify the body through various methods. And sure, I noticed that the stearic acid actually can induce a level of detoxification. And I was wondering if you could speak to that, if you've ever seen that. And maybe my question really, in addition to that, is whether stearic acid has surfactant qualities.
Well,
you're almost dissolving residue and taking it out of the body to some degree. And this can include, based on my limited research, in terms of my tools, but I believe that I've seen evidence of heavy metals and other things coming out.
Right. I mean, that's possible. It's certainly not my area of expertise. So I don't want to go too far.
I'm not saying it's a bad thing. It could be a good thing, right? This is not necessarily a bad thing. It's just a kind of FYI, or just.
Oh, right, sure. No, I mean, it's a very interesting observation, and like I say, that's not my area of focus, so I don't know that much about it. I do know that yeah, I'm gonna let me
reel that in, because at a basic level, if we have a lot of fat and we begin to replace that fat, right, and the fat literally kind of, on some level, kind of melts away, right, and fat is known to store all kinds of toxins. So if you start melting the fat, you might have a detox from whatever was in that fat.
Right.
In addition to that, I did wonder if it might even act as a kind of surfactant to release calcified areas or things like that. Lee and I spoke about this a number of times because we felt like it was having a kind of surfactant effect. And I know that sounds kind of wishy-washy and not very scientific, but that's the best language we could come up with.
Right. No, I mean, it's very interesting. And this is the first time that I've thought about it, and I don't, I'm not sure how we would, I'm not quite sure how we would answer that question, but I'm glad that you're bringing it up, because now I'm going to put it in my thought bank and think on that a bit. So maybe, I guess,
I mean, just even looking at literature on stearic acid and surfactants and looking at chemical composition and that kind of thing. I mean, who knows what that could spark in your thought process.
Yeah. And there is, stearic acid is used as as kind of an emulsifier in foods, I believe.
Yes, that's what got us on this whole subject.
Yeah. And so I know it is used for that in food manufacturing. Yeah, it's interesting. I'm not sure is my answer, but it's an interesting it's an area of future research, I guess.
So another question, is there such a thing as a lipostat?
Well, so so this is something
I'm coming at you.
Right. No, so this is what Sol is referencing. This is something that I've kind of floated in a couple of places, this idea of a lipostat. And actually, that was what I was mentioning about the palm oil. Because what happens is when someone, there's a really interesting study with pregnant women who become, you see this in all kinds of diabetes. What you see is that when people are becoming obese and when they're becoming diabetic, their levels of stearic acid in their stored body fats really drop. And there was one study in particular lately that I saw, and it was with pregnant women who got gestational diabetes. And over the course of their pregnancies, the level of stearic acid in their plasma, it just plunged. It dropped by 30 or 40%. It was a big drop. And so when I see that, when you know how stearic acid behaves, and when you see that, okay, in obesity, in diabetes, levels of stearic acid drop, levels of plasma, circulating stearic acid drop, is that a signal to the organism? It's like, okay, stearic acid is dropping. That means that we are in, we're in a torpid mode. We're in a fat storing mode. And what's triggering that is, and so to me, what that would look like is if when you do de novo lipogenesis, so now you're eating starch, you're eating sugar, you're eating alcohol, and you're converting that into fat, you're mostly making palmitic acid, which is a 16 carbon saturated fat, and you're making oleic acid, which is what's in olive oil, and that's an 18 carbon monounsaturated fat. But then that would presumably be kickstarted by eating polyunsaturated fat, linoleic acid, in the first place. And so to me, the sort of signature motif of an organism that is making fat is going to be, you're going to see a lot of palmitic acid, a lot of oleic acid, and a decent amount of linoleic acid that's coming in from the diet. And you're going to see very little stearic acid. And that is exactly the composition of palm oil. And that's why I don't like palm oil. And when you look at feeding studies, animal feeding studies, palm oil makes things very fat. And so people say palm oil is a saturated fat. It's somewhat true. It's more saturated than other vegetable oils, but it's not really that saturated at the end of the day. And it's the perfect composition to mimic an animal that's eating vegetable oil and doing a lot of de novo lipogenesis. And so that's my question, is some of the effects that we're seeing with stearic acid, can the body kind of read the composition of the circulating fats, and do the individual cells and tissues, are they making decisions from what they see with those fats? And those decisions would right, that lipostat would be very dynamic, because what would be happening is individual tissues would be taking in circulating fats out of the bloodstream and trying to burn them, and it's going to come down to those dynamics that I was talking about, which ones enter the mitochondria faster, and then which ones are generating more ROS. And those two variables are kind of going to determine whether or not in any given cell, it's, if the mitochondria are burning cleanly, and if you're going to have a good metabolic rate and burn clean, or if you're going to be in reductive stress and kind of burn dirty and start to do de novo lipogenesis. And so that's my explanation of what I mean by the lipostat, and or the lipostat. And it's something that I think about a lot, and I haven't really written that down anywhere. So that's just straight out of my head. I haven't.
Yeah, I definitely think there's something to it, and reading through your material, and I feel like there's a lot there that's going to be unpacked over time that you're probably like downloading. There's just something going on there. I've got 3 more questions that hopefully we can get through pretty quickly, because I know you're on a timer here, but these are
and it's not too bad. We can go a little over what I thought. The thing I thought was going to happen hasn't happened, so we're here. Let's keep going if you want.
I just want everybody to know Brad's in his pickup truck. Is that right, on your farm?
Yeah, that's right. Well, I'm on the pickup truck on the side of a road, but it's okay.
I love it. I love it. So I learned about, and I'm going to butcher the pronunciation, I'm sure, Pu-erh Tea from you somewhere.
Yes.
on your blog. And so that's spelled Pu-erh. And I found this Numi organic chocolate Pu-erh tea that I mix with. So I make it, and then I melt cacao in it, right? And then I add a little bit of just cream, right?
Right.
And it is absolutely an amazing coffee replacement. And you could add stevia or some other sweetener to it if you wanted to do that. Just absolutely fascinating. So I wanted people to know that's what I'm doing. Are you still down with Pu-erh tea? And if so, could you enlighten us in terms of what it's doing in relation to the Croissant Diet?
Yeah, and so the Pu-erh tea was something that I had written about. I had written a whole series of articles called SCD-1. The series of articles I wrote called the SCD-1 theory of obesity. And again, SCD-1 is that enzyme that actually unsaturates your body fat. So it's turning your stored stearic acid into oleic acid, and it's fighting you, and it's trying to keep you in torpor in that kind of fat storing mode. And so someone else had found in the literature this reference to this Pu-erh tea, and saying that it suppressed SCD-1 levels of this enzyme, and sure enough, and so I went and checked it out, and sure enough, it has pretty impressive results, and it's, like you say, it's delicious tea. People really like it, and it's available. It's easy enough to find. And so, yeah, I think a lot of people have had good results with it. I've drunk it at times. I'm not personally a tea drinker, so I struggle to stick with it, but I think it's I really think it is a good idea, though.
Well, I'm not making any recommendations, but I sometimes mix it. I put 2 tea bags in, one of this Numi organic tea, and I put a dandelion, like a roasted dandelion tea with it. And something about that combination just feels really good in my body.
Right.
That's
interesting.
Spin on that. So I lied. I've got one more question, and so that would be 3 from now. So what about chicken liver and PUFAs? I know that you've talked about how the white meat in chickens contains a little bit less of these PUFAs, but what about the organ meats?
Yeah, I mean, so most chicken, right? So here's where people have to use their judgment. I mean, so chicken, like I say, can be a high source of PUFA, but most of the fat from the chicken is in the skin and is in the obvious kind of clinging fat. After you take the skin off, there are bits of what are just fat, and those, the skin and the obvious fat on the chicken is very high in polyunsaturated fat. The chicken liver, you know, as long as it's not chicken foie gras or something,
Right.
you know, it's pretty low. It's a pretty low fat food, right? Chicken livers are not high in fat in general. And so you're probably not going to overload yourself with PUFA by eating some chicken livers. You know what I mean? If it was if they were fatty chicken livers, then I would say, well, maybe avoid those. But most chicken livers pretty lean. And so I think, you know, if people want to eat lean chicken breast or chicken livers or cuts like that, you know, I don't think there's a problem with it from a PUFA perspective, as long as that's not the only, you know, source of fat that you're getting, kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah. So I wouldn't go crazy on them, but I think some chicken is fine as long as it's really lean cuts, you know.
I wanted to interject here that really this diet is quite expansive. There's a handful of areas that you need to finesse, I would say, but really compared to many other diets, this diet allows you to eat very freely if you just get some things right, and not always in restaurants necessarily, but certainly if you're cooking a lot at home and that sort of thing, boy, you can really add some things in you probably left out a long time ago if you've been on the so-called health bandwagon.
Yeah, for sure. And I want to say, I just want to put this out there. Again, I kind of brushed on ROS in the beginning, and since I wrote the original Croissant Diet, my thinking about ROS has evolved a bit. Even in more, you know, when I first wrote the ROS Theory of Obesity, I was thinking about reactive oxygen species production purely from the perspective of insulin signaling. So after you've eaten, ROS levels in your cells rise, and that actually shuts off insulin signaling. A lot of the molecules that are involved in insulin signaling stop working if there are too much ROS around. If hydrogen peroxide levels build up, is really what it is. It shuts off insulin signaling, which is good because insulin is signaling energy to enter the cell, and if you've already got enough energy in the cell, you want to stop that from happening, right? But more and more recently, what I've realized is that the production of the ROS actually is a thermogenic thing, and they're increasing your metabolic rate, and they're doing, the way that they're doing that is,
Oh, that's brilliant, Brad.
you know, it's a little complicated, but here's what I've realized recently is that, and I said this in the beginning of the show, but so the pyruvate dehydrogenase, the key enzyme really in glucose metabolism, is also cranking out reactive oxygen species as it's running. And so when you think about, so now when we talk about, like, you know, sure, eating a croissant, right? It's mostly starch, which is glucose, and it's saturated fat from butter. And the starch and the saturated fat both produce reactive oxygen species as you're burning them in the mitochondria. And that's a way to increase the amount of oxygen that you're burning. And it's a way to get your mitochondria to burn more cleanly. Like I use the analogy of cars used to have, I'm spacing on the word now, not radiators, but
Like
the thing that
the catalytic converters.
the part that mixes the fuel and the air before it goes into the pistons. Anyway,
You're not talking to a mechanic. Let's put it that way.
yeah. Anyways, it doesn't matter what it's called. But the point is that if you get the fuel mixture too rich, if you have too much fuel and not enough oxygen, it doesn't burn cleanly. And that's when you see like black smoke coming out of the tailpipe of a car. It's because it's not mixing enough oxygen with the fuel. And the ROS, it really allows more oxygen to come into the fuel as it burns in the mitochondria, and allows the mitochondria to burn clean. And the thing is, both the glucose and the saturated fat are doing that. They're producing the ROS and they're helping things to burn cleanly. But the polyunsaturated fats, they don't produce the ROS. And so they're not getting the same amount of oxygen mixing with the fuel as it burns, and they start to burn dirty. And that's when you start to see the buildup of the acetyl-CoA and the NADH in the mitochondria. And that's when you start to see the reductive stress, and you start to do de novo lipogenesis. You know, you start to make fat instead of burning fat. And so that's where the kind of ROS theory has evolved over the last couple of years. Is now I think that they're even, I now think they're even more important than I thought when I first started, and that
Wow.
it's actually injecting more oxygen into the fuel mix, and it's helping the fuel to burn cleanly. And that's done through an enzyme called NNT. And I've got a bunch of articles on the blog talking about that if people want to research into that further. But yes, a reactive oxygen species absolutely increases the amount of oxygen that you burn, without a doubt. And that
Great
is,
analogy too. Great analogy. It really helps one see what's going on.
carburetor. The carburetor is the thing that mixes the fuel in the air.
Yeah, right. Right. It just really makes a lot of sense. Okay, another question. Any reason to pulse the diet, like to go between PUFAs and other modalities?
I don't know if I would perfectly purposefully pulse in the PUFAs. One thing I think is that the more that I've learned about kind of the dynamics of how the PUFA are stored and how long, like, how we get rid of them, I've become a little more like, I'm less worried now if I like go to a restaurant once a week or once every couple of weeks and eat something that's maybe questionable, right? That shouldn't have a lot of polyunsaturated fat in it, but maybe it does, and maybe you don't know, and there's no way to tell. So I now think, like, if you're avoiding the polyunsaturated fats 6 days a week, 13 days out of 14, and one time you have a meal that has more than you expected, I think it's probably okay. I think, due to the fact that they are preferentially oxidized, I think the body is actually trying to get rid of them most of the time. It's just that, when you eat the standard American diet and every day you're getting, 10, 15, 20% of your calories from polyunsaturated fats, they're gonna build up in your body tissues, and then you're gonna have real problems. But I've become a little less worried about, like, the occasional meal that either you eat at someone's house or you eat at a restaurant, you eat out, and maybe there's more in there than you expected. I don't sweat that as much as I once did, I guess.
That's good. That's really good for people to know. And I think you make a really good point that if you're not inundating your body with PUFAs, and the body is designed in some sense to burn these things off almost like a toxin, then it's going to be able to handle a little bit of just a blip of an increase, as opposed to this steady stream of I guess toxicity would be a word I would use.
Yeah, and even, I mean, toxicity to some extent, but mostly it's just changing the mitochondrial dynamics. That's the real issue with the polyunsaturated fats. They're just not burning right. It's like,
right.
It's like putting gas in a diesel engine or something.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, for me, my thinking about what constitutes a toxin is pretty broad, because it's really anything that it harms or inhibits the body, right? So
Right, sure.
you could look at it broadly, but maybe not classically in that way. So last major question here is, here we've been eating this way for quite a while in this culture, right? And we're into multiple generations of this way of eating, and it's just getting worse, obviously. And a lot of people, a lot of obesity problems. What do you think the prognosis is for people being able to kind of get out of torpor and stay out of torpor? Because I have a feeling like if you stuck a French person who'd been eating ancestrally for a long time in a different dietary environment, that they might not actually have weight problems in their lifetime, but maybe their children would. What do you
agree. I agree with you. I see it being something that is the first generation, for whatever reason, seems to deal with it okay. It's usually the children of the first generation where you see the obesity, and you can see that pretty quickly. You see that we have newborns in America who are obese, coming out of the womb, you know.
Right.
That's not because the child was late, didn't exercise enough in the womb, you know. No, it's not. And it's not because they were overeating, you know. There's a biological problem there, right? And so and that is so, yeah, no, but I think you're exactly right. I think that some of this is a second generation and a third generation problem, and you also see that it seems like it gets progressively worse through the generations. Yeah, and it's concerning, but I do have hope. I have a lot of hope that we can figure out a way to get out of this mess. I'm the eternal optimist. So yeah, and I keep experimenting all the time. My latest thing I've been experimenting with is a couple of things called, one is pyruvate, and another one, and I've been talking a lot about this, I just did a video about it, but I've been using a combination of pyruvate and L-carnitine, and that comes from well, it came out of a couple papers that I was really technical, really hard papers, and they were doing some clever tricks with L-carnitine and pyruvate around mitochondrial stuff, and I said, I started thinking about them together, and I said they really do go a long way. What L-carnitine does is it can actually pull acetyl-CoA out of the mitochondria and sort of like store it, not permanently, but while it needs to in the cytoplasm. And what pyruvate does is it actually cells who have too much NADH, and that's the problem. We have too much when we're doing de novo lipogenesis. We have too much acetyl-CoA and we have too much NADH. And so pyruvate cells can actually, pyruvate is just a breakdown product of glucose. And so pyruvate, but it's missing a couple NADHs. It's missing a few electrons that would normally be the high energy electrons that would give us NADH, right? So it's kind of like glucose light. It's glucose, but it's had these NADH groups removed. And so when you eat that, it's pretty easily absorbed, and we have pyruvate that circulates in our bloodstream all the time, and cells will take in that pyruvate and they can reduce it to lactate, and every time they make that reaction, they get rid of an NADH. And so the pyruvate can allow your cells to basically directly offload any extra NADH that they have, and the carnitine can pull acetyl-CoA out of the mitochondria. And so those two things together, I was like, this seems pretty powerful. And so I started, searching for it on Google Scholar, and I found this study from 1999 where they had given a combination. They'd given L-carnitine and pyruvate, and they had these incredible weight loss results. And it was a small study, and they were like, this is too small to like really draw conclusions with. And it was only like 3 or 4 weeks, but they'd had these like outstanding results. And that was cool, because I was like, okay, in theory, I think if you combine these two things, it would be a really good idea. And then I found this old study, and of course, pyruvate became very trendy in the late 90s, and then somebody made a bunch of claims about it that weren't really true, and I think they ended up, they got sued, or they got in some kind of trouble for, basically over-representing pyruvate. But I kind of think, they threw the baby out with the bathwater, because I do think it is really good, on its own. If you're eating a bunch of soybean oil and you're doing all the wrong things, it's probably not going to help you. But if you get the soybean oil out, and if you can add the pyruvate and the acetyl, or in the L-carnitine together, I've only been doing it for a week or two, but the results so far are great, and I'm very enthusiastic about this combination, and potentially in combination.
Them, Brad,
what's up?
How are you taking them? What do you
Oh,
have
yeah. So the pyruvate is not very soluble. Like, I was thinking I would just be able to like dissolve it and drink it, and it's not very soluble. And so, but I found out that in hot water it's fine. So I heat up some hot water in the tea kettle, and I usually use a couple teaspoons of sugar and one of pyruvate, but if people want to use sugar, of course they can use whatever kind of sweetener they want. It has kind of a funny bitter flavor on its own, so it wants a little bit of sweetener. But I just pour hot water over it, and then I add ice until it's cold. And sometimes I put seltzer on it, and it's almost like a weird little. The pyruvate has this kind of like caramel bitter flavor.
And what
So
about
it's almost like,
is that a pill or a capsule?
right. So I've been getting mine, and this is a shameless commercial plug, but I've been getting it from bulksupplements.com, and I'm in their affiliate network. So if people want to use
Yes, please.
FIRE FIRE is a promo code. They get 12% off. The pyruvate it's just a powder, and I would say upper limit. It's calcium pyruvate. I think with pyruvate itself, you could consume as much as you want. You probably don't want that much calcium, so I'd say upper limit. That's a good idea. Is maybe 10 to 12 grams a day of pyruvate, which is in some of the studies, people were doing 50 grams of just pure pyruvate, but it's not very stable unless you get the calcium pyruvate. And so that's very convenient, comes in a powder. So you can, with the L-carnitine, you can take it just with the pyruvate. They also have a powdered version, and you can add that right to the beverage. You only want, for a day, about 2 grams of carnitine is about the max that's probably helpful. Okay. And so I would say, if people do 12 grams a day of the pyruvate and 2 grams of the L-carnitine, it really is you'll give off a lot of heat. It really is. It's very thermogenic. So
that's interesting.
So when I take those two together, my body temperature always hits 98.6 within 20 minutes.
Oh, that's fascinating.
And if I do that and then I go eat a bowl of rice, sometimes my body temperature will be over 100.
So do you actually sweat when you're eating after that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'm sweating right now because I took some a while ago.
Yeah, that's pretty good for upstate New York, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And it's actually kind of a cooler day. So so it's amazing. So that's my new thing that I've been doing. It's been great. So I'm down a few pounds, and I'm just sweating it out here. Yeah.
Well, you sound great. You sound like you're really approaching your fighting weight, and I so appreciate your time. I know this has been kind of a crazy afternoon for you, but I do really want to thank you and honor you for this time that you spent with us. I feel like you've opened up my brain and poured a bunch of information in it, and I'm kind of working through it, and I imagine other people might feel the same way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I'm happy to be on, and I hope people got some info out of this, and hopefully maybe think about a few things differently as a result of this.
I know they will, Brad. Listen, once again, thank you so much. I'll get this up in the next couple days, and just let me know if I can be of service, my friend.
Yeah, excellent. And let me just plug a couple things. My blog is fireinabottle.net, and people can follow along on Twitter. I'm fire_bottle, and I've also am on Instagram. I've been starting to do a lot more videos. So
ask you about Instagram.
I think I'm fire_in_a_bottle on Instagram.
There you go.
But I'm not totally sure what my handle is, but I think that's it.
Yeah, let me just make a note of that. That's good. Fire in a bottle.
Yeah.
I mean, this is an education. You can just enter into Brad's world, and starting with fireinabottle.net, and just you'll read a long time, and then make sure you read the comments and the discussions that happen afterwards, because I found those really illuminating as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of smart people in the comments, so it's good.
Right.
I learn a lot from the commenters.
Oh, do you?
Yeah, for sure.
I love that. I love it when we can kind of give back and forth.
Oh, and I should say there's also a great discussion about stearic acid and other things on the Reddit group, which is r/saturated fat.
r/saturated fat. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, you're just so techie.
Well, I didn't start that. Somebody else started it.
That's great. That's great. I love it. Yeah. Well, people are really starting to kind of dig into this, as it were. Gets pun intended, and because there's a lot of food for thought,